So, why is this important? I think that obviously computer security continues to be a problem, and we face more and more sophisticated adversaries who are able to, get past our traditional defenses and continue to compromise our networks. And so we need new ways of thinking about the problem that we face. The other thing is that we tend to believe that in computer security that attackers have all the cards, that they have all the advantages. Typically, we talk about asymmetry from a vulnerability standpoint. Attackers can exploit any vulnerability that they find in our environment. If they find one successfully, that means they can get in. As defenders, we've got to cover all of those bases. And so we have a much more complicated problem than the attackers do. And so if you couple the fact that we have a more complicated problem with the fact that sometimes these attackers have significant amounts of resources to find vulnerabilities and target us, it puts us in a very defensive situation. And really one of the things we'd like to be able to do is find ways to change our perspective about the problem and to think about it in a way that highlights the natural advantages that defenders have. And that can lead us to approaches that are perhaps more successful than the ones that we've been engaged in traditionally. So what is military doctrine? Military doctrine is the way that militaries think academically about conflict. And of course, military conflict has been going on for a very long time. Lots of people are familiar with Sun Tzu. We told a joke at Black Hat that we would not reference Sun Tzu at any point during this presentation, and that will remain true for this webinar. In Western military thought, particularly in American military thought, there are, these are some of the luminaries. Baron de Jomini and Clausewitz are 17th century thinkers who sort of set out our basic ideas about the purpose of warfare and the way that it functions, and sort of how warfare happens. Of course, their writing continues to have a lot of influence on military thinkers today. Alfred Thayer Mahan, he is a person who sort of influenced American naval power, particularly around the turn of the last century, and led the United States to becoming a more powerful naval force. And then Boyd, we're going to go into detail about some of Boyd's ideas. He was an Air Force pilot, and put a lot of thought into his process as a fighter. He's been very influential across a lot of operational thinking. So those are traditional sources that continue to be valuable. Of course, there are modern sources that are used operationally in the military today. There's all these manuals, the FM manual series, many of which you can find online, that explain what the military thinks its current procedures are for a variety of different problems. There are also, doctrine is something that evolves, and so there's a constant dialogue about doctrine. There's journals where people in the military talk about new ideas, and they sort of have a dialogue that leads to the emergence of new doctrine. Of course, there are forums and discussions on the internet. One of the things that we threw up during the Black Hat talk was this internet personality called Doctrine Man, and it's mostly he's kind of a character that pokes fun at the U.S. military and the U.S. military, sometimes the U.S. military's use of doctrine. And so if you Google him up, he can be an entertaining person to follow on Facebook. So the other thing to say about doctrine is that, let me step back. The reason, as I said, that we're interested in doctrine is because militaries have been thinking about conflict for hundreds of years. When we're talking about people breaking into our computer networks, inherently we're talking about conflict. And it may be that the way, the structure of the thoughts that some of that old military thinking applies to the problem, may be relevant to what we're trying to do in cybersecurity. It may provide us with a new way of thinking about cybersecurity. But another thing to understand about it is that it can be interpreted in an overly rigid way that makes your actions predictable. A couple of years ago, I started practicing martial arts. One of the things you learn when you start practicing martial arts is that you're taught this structure. You're taught to sort of put in your muscle memory certain kinds of movements, and you're taught the structure for how you fight. And someone who's sort of a mid-grade martial artist is often very vulnerable to untrained attackers, because untrained attackers do unpredictable things. They don't follow the structure that you're learning when you're learning martial arts. And so if your mind is too wedded to that structure, then you exhibit behaviors that are easy to predict and exploit. And that can also be true with respect to any kind of military doctrine. If you're engaged in an operational process, and your adversary knows what that process is, then he can predict what you're going to do, and that enables him to potentially take advantage of that. And so, this is a quote from a Russian naval commander sort of complaining that Americans don't typically follow their own doctrine. That can be very frustrating for him. But doctrine is a useful source of insight, but at the same time, we shouldn't rigidly follow it because it can make us weak if we do so. There's been a lot of discussion in cybersecurity over the last couple of years about the kill chain, and I think it's a great example of a piece of military doctrine that has, in fact, changed the way that we think about cybersecurity. And I think it kind of proves our overall thesis, that there are interesting things in military doctrine that we can apply to what we do, and if we do it well, it can make us better at what we do. I want to start by talking about the kill chain and provide you some background on it. Hopefully you're already pretty familiar with it, and I'll use that as a starting point, and then I'll start to talk about some other doctrinal concepts that we also think are very relevant to the practice of information security, and I'll talk about how they're relevant as well. And hopefully you'll begin to see that really this is a vast ocean with many, many, many opportunities, and really the work that's gone on so far has probably just scratched the surface of what's possible here. So the kill chain is a concept that comes out of the Air Force. And basically, the idea is that there are a set of stages that you go through when you are going to launch. If you're a guy that launches a missile, there's a set of stages that involve in launching that missile. You're going to find your target, fix and track the target. You're actually going to engage with the target, and then you're going to assess, whether or not the target has been successfully destroyed. Some enterprising folks over at Lockheed Martin wrote a very interesting paper called the Cyber Kill Chain a few years ago. And what they did is they thought about people breaking into their computer networks and what is the kill chain that those attackers follow as they engage in their attacks. And so they started laying out these stages, and the way that they define the stages, they start with reconnaissance to figure out what vulnerabilities the target has. They engage in weaponization, which is where you maybe take a document that belongs to your victim and you put some exploit code in it, and you turn it into something that can launch an attack. Delivery of that exploit to the target, the actual execution of the exploitation, maybe installation of malware, initiation of a command and control channel from that affected host back to the attacker, and then actions on objectives, like whatever the attacker was planning to do once they had successful gotten in. This is the kill chain that Lockheed Martin described. And what's interesting about this kill chain are really two things. The first is that it sort of turns asymmetry on its head, because it gives you a multi-step process to look at that the attacker is going through. And you can ask, can I disrupt this attacker at each stage of this process? What are the controls that I can put in place that could effectively disrupt this attacker at each stage? And so instead of having a situation where you've got lots of vulnerabilities to cover and the attacker only has to find one, you now find yourself in a situation where the attacker has to make it successfully through a complicated multi-stage process, and each step of the way you have an opportunity to disrupt what they're doing. And so this is just a different way of thinking about what we do, but it really highlights an advantage that we have as defenders. And that's really what we've got to be thinking about if we're going to put ourselves in a position where we're effective against these adversaries. In addition, the Lockheed Martin paper talks about the way that you can utilize threat intelligence as you're analyzing these incidents and you obtain information about the adversary. You can align those pieces of information to the kill chain, and that can allow you to identify when multiple have occurred from the same attacker. It can enable you to determine it can enable you to determine so hopefully, basically, what it can do is it can point the way potentially to detecting other attacks earlier on in their life cycle before they become fully formed. I think that I kind of made these points already. I think that there are different models for the kill chain. The Lockheed Martin model, I think it has this thing at the end that says actions on objectives. At Landcope, we like to expand that part out and talk about it in more detail because the reality is that when an attacker breaks into your network, when they get their foothold on the first PC they've infected, that's one step in a multi-step process. And so, the first thing that they're going to do is break into a system, but then they're going to looking around in your environment to try to find other systems that they can infect and try to find the data that they're looking to exfiltrate. Once they find that data, they might stage it somewhere and prepare it for exfiltration, and then eventually they might, move it out to their to their network. And so all of those stages are also potential places where you can disrupt the attacker. And so I think they deserve to be included in a complete kill chain model. So like I said, the kill chain, it's been around for a few years. I think most people are familiar with it. If you have not read Lockheed Martin's paper on the kill chain, I strongly suggest doing so. It's probably one of the most important information security papers that's come out in the past few years. I think it's evidence that if we take inspiration from some of these military doctrinal ideas, they can lead to new insights that are potentially powerful. So the next thing that I'm going to talk about is terrain analysis. So the Army has a way of thinking about a battlefield. If you're ever bored, there's a very long movie about the Battle of Gettysburg that does a good job. I think it's just called Gettysburg, and it does a good job of sort of talking about some of the tactical maneuvers that occurred during the battle. But they're very interested in determining where the high ground is and what the avenues of approach to that high ground are, because they learn that the high ground has a huge impact on how a battle progresses. And if you look at Gettysburg, you can see the way that high ground played an influential role throughout that battle in terms of what the people involved chose to do. So the Army has this formalized process for looking at a battlefield and trying to decide where the high ground is, what the avenues of approach to that high ground are, how people could potentially how vulnerable that ground is in terms of fields of fire and the like, how they could defend it. The analytic process is called a COCA. Observations, you look at observations in the fields of fire, cover and concealment, obstacles, key terrain, and avenues of approach. So my same co-conspirators, David, Greg, and I, we wrote a paper for a conference called SciCon, where we took this ACOCA analysis process and we applied it to a computer network in order to try to identify the high ground in cyberspace and to talk about what the significance of the high ground in cyberspace is, and just to kind of see where it would take us. So one of the things that David and Greg are very interested in is the cyberspace planes concept, where we tend sometimes to think about, I guess to me, when I think about terrain in cyberspace, I think about it almost entirely at the network layer. I think about it at the IP layer. I think of endpoints with IP addresses and the ports that are running on them. I think about it in that world. Military commanders have a different sort of narrowness when they think about this problem. They tend to think about it specifically as physical things. They think about physical machines and wires between them, rather than sort of conceptualizing this as within the network layer in terms of ports and protocols. What Greg and David are saying is that this is actually a big stack that includes, the physical device itself, the network OSI layers, the software that's running on top of them, the identities of the users that are accessing them, and as well as the supervisory systems that control them. So it's useful to think about all these different planes and the way that the terrain analysis can hop from one plane to another. So basically it's useful to think through this COCA process from the perspective of an attacker as well as a defender. And that's one of the things that we went through in this paper. And let me start from the perspective of a defender. When you think through the process this way, it's very similar to the analytic process that somebody who's building a computer network and trying to defend it architecturally goes through. You start by trying to identify what your key assets are. What are the crown jewels that you're trying to protect? And then you consider, what are all the interfaces to these crown jewels? What are the network interfaces? Are there, can people put USB keys in, whatever? What are all the different ways to get there? Those are your avenues of approach. And then for each of those avenues of approach, how can you, from where can you access that avenue of approach? So what are the fields of fire? So for example, if one of your crown jewels is a server, it's like a database that has a lot of valuable information in it, and you plug it into a network, that network may be an avenue of approach. The field of fire is, anywhere where that IP address is reachable, right? So maybe it's only visible from the local network, so that's a very constrained field of fire. Maybe you, have it out on the internet, and so there's a whole bunch of places where the attacker can hit it from. And of course, if it's a local network, the next question you have to ask is, well, how can someone get access to this local network? What are the different things connected to it? What is a route to get in? And so you perform this iterative analysis, and you begin to develop a picture which looks a lot like the graph down at the bottom. And of course, you do this at all of these different planes, but basically the key terrain in cyberspace emerges, and these are nodes in the graph that have a high degree of interconnectivity, as well as nodes in the graph that are closely related to key assets. And so, I think that the reality is that attacks in the real world follow this process. When an attacker breaks into your network, a sophisticated targeted attacker, it is often the case that they go after your domain controller very early on in the process. And the reason is that the domain controller is a piece of cyber high ground. It's a very highly interconnected resource. It touches everything in your environment. It has all the identities in it. And so, it's a natural place that they want to gain control of because it provides them with access to everything else. And so, this thought process, basically the point is that there's a close relationship between the way that, you think about terrain analysis and the way that you think about network segmentation. And I think that the real interesting insight for me in going through this process was that as defenders, we ought to understand this architecture that we have. We ought to know what assets we have in our internal network. We ought to know how they're interconnected. We ought to know, what the avenues of approach to those assets are. And furthermore, we're actually in control of it. We can create this environment and we can change it. The attacker's problem is much different. When we start looking at this from the perspective of the attacker, they don't have visibility into everything at the outset. They can only see what they can see from the outside world using the reconnaissance that they do. And every time they break into a system or a network, that provides them with limited visibility into whatever that particular asset has access to. And so they don't have this big picture perspective that we as defenders have. And I think, again, that's a huge advantage that defenders have. It's the home court advantage that I don't think that as computer security professionals we really emphasize enough or we do enough to take advantage of. So so the next concept that I'm going to go to has to do with taking advantage of this home court advantage that we have. It has to do with exploiting the attacker's lack of knowledge of the terrain. One of the challenges when you're dealing with sophisticated targeted attacks is figuring out, that the attacker is even there. They are hitting you with a vulnerability that is not going to be disclosed for many months. You can't possibly patch for it. You're not going to detect it coming in. Your AV is not going to detect their malware. It's very difficult to even know that you're compromised. And so, what are things that you can do to help turn the tables in your favor to increase the likelihood that you're going to actually discover this activity happening in your environment? Well, one of the things that you can do is put decoy assets in your environment. People have talked about honeypotting, for years, but usually when they talk about honeypotting, they talk about putting a honeypot out on the internet. And the reason that's not very interesting is because there's a whole bunch of people who are scanning the internet for vulnerable systems, and most of them are not very interesting attackers. I don't care what, these people that are scanning the whole internet are doing, because chances are very good that I can keep them out of my network. What I am interested in, so what I'm talking about is honeypotting from more of a targeted perspective that has more to do with detecting attacks happening within my environment that are not supposed to be there. And they're not just as a way of analyzing attacker artifacts, they're a way of identifying the presence of things that are happening in my internal network that aren't supposed to be happening. So conceptually, when I got into thinking about this, I went out and picked up a book, an intelligence analysis book on the concept of denial and deception. Denial has to do with preventing your adversary from knowing something that is true. So it has to do with dissimulation or concealing of the truth. Camouflage may be a good example of denial. It's just trying to make sure that your adversary is not aware of something that is present. And then deception, separately, means the simulation of something that is false. Evoking in the mind of your adversary a fact that is not true, causing them to believe something that isn't real. And so you can think about denial and deception as tools that you can use when you architect your network in order to create features that are potentially misleading to adversaries. So when I talk about denial, maybe I want to take important things and make them a little bit less obvious. Maybe I want to have a hidden file system, or I can take a service and move it to an unusual port, where you wouldn't expect it to be. I can also employ deception. I can put things out there that aren't real. I can run, a fake service somewhere, where it's not really present. One of the examples I used is, putting RDP on domain controllers. A modern domain controller should not it's not possible to put RDP on it. It used to be possible to put RDP on a domain controller, and people used to do it, and I've seen people get compromised because they did it. So Microsoft has eventually, now decided that they were just going to make it very difficult for that to occur. But if you put it there and somebody touches it, what are they doing? It's a very subtle thing that you could put out in your environment that somebody might see and they might interact with, and if they interact with it, now you know they're there. You didn't catch their exploit, you didn't catch their malware, but you're aware of their presence. And that's the advantage that you're trying to get. It's really a knowledge advantage. You want to know more about the adversary that's operating in your network than they realize that you know. And if you have that information edge on them, then you're in control of the situation. And I think that network denial and deception, I think there's a tremendous amount of investigation that can be done into those subjects. I think it's really an untapped area for exploration. One of the things that we do at Landco in this area is just because we're looking at everything happening on the network, it's really easy for us to instrument canary ports and services that will alarm to the administrator if someone touches them, knowing that nothing should be there. We have an event that's coming out in the new version of our product called Talks to Phantoms that tries to identify hosts in the environment that are trying to interact with systems that aren't there. If you're trying to interact with systems that aren't there, then you're probably engaged in reconnaissance. And we might not be detecting you with one of these scanning signatures because you might be subtle enough about what you're doing that you're not setting off scan alarms. But still, you're poking around in places that you shouldn't be, and that might be enough to start an investigation. So, I think to underline this point that I'm trying to make here, we talk about how the human is the weakest link in our defense a lot. And there's a lot of debate about end user education and how do you keep people from clicking on things. The human is also the weakest link in the offense. If somebody is breaking into your network, they're a person. And I don't think in computer security we think enough about how to exploit the human as a defender. And that's really what I'm trying to get to, with some of this denial and deception stuff. How do you manipulate the person that's trying to break into your network and cause them to reveal themselves to you and to do things that they don't desire to do? So a huge part of winning that battle is it boils down to OPSEC, operations security. Operations security is a military concept, and it's part of the different military concepts that I'm going to talk about in this talk. It's probably the one that I think people in the information security world have the best familiarity with and are most comfortable with. But I think that it's a critical aspect of both how attackers function and actually how defenders ought to function, although unfortunately defenders often don't consider this issue. So OPSEC really has to do with behaving in such a way that you avoid disclosing information unnecessarily. There's this poster that says "Loose tweet, think fleet." Back during World War II, there was all this propaganda that tried to encourage people not to, to mention where their husband was deployed on the phone, or provide unnecessary information in places where it wasn't needed. And the point is that piece of information in isolation might not be that valuable, but your adversary may be able to connect it with a bunch of other dots that they've collected and get a bigger picture that is really not something you're aware of when you disclose that one fact. And so if everybody sort of operates with care regarding the information that they have access to, then you reduce the threat surface area. So let's talk about this from a cybersecurity standpoint. I think that, excuse me, I think that OPSEC is tremendously important to attackers because attackers, are ultimately trying not to get caught, and often they're trying to do what they're doing without even being observed. And so they have to prevent the defender from becoming aware of their operation in the first place, or maybe becoming aware of aspects of the operation. So, I break this down into 3 levels. The first is secrecy of the fact of the operation, avoiding detection, or when detected, appear to be something else. This often comes up in the context of advanced persistent threat. People are aware of the term advanced persistent threat, and they really get hung up on what those terms mean in the technical sense, whereas that acronym is really intended as a general term to refer to a particular kind of adversary. And so they expected that if their network is being targeted by state-sponsored attackers, that those attackers are going to use really sophisticated malware. And so when they find a piece of malware on their network that is not that sophisticated, they have a tendency to assume the attacker must not be very sophisticated, and they ignore the issue, which is exactly what the attacker desires. There's a particular malware called Poison Ivy that up until quite recently, something changed, but up until recently you could download it off a publicly available website. And it's a malware that I've seen used in a lot of state-sponsored attack activity. And it's just convenient. It's easy to use. They pack it so it doesn't get detected, and it's reliable. And so that's why it gets used. And people find it and they say, well, that's Poison Ivy. Anybody can download Poison Ivy, so this must not be a sophisticated attack, and they just ignore it. That's in a sense that's a good OPSEC on the part of the attacker, because they're not revealing to the defender when they discover the attack that something sophisticated is going on. Sometimes attacks are going to happen where it's inevitable that defenders are going to find out about them. So if you think about botnets like CryptoLocker, these bots infect machines all over the place, and inevitably the botnets fall into the hands of analysts, and they get analyzed. So sometimes attackers want to do things to prevent the defenders from knowing certain information about their operation, even though other information about the operation is inevitably available. Classically, we think about domain generation algorithms as being a tool that malware authors use in order to prevent defenders from predicting what IP address they're going to show up next with on the internet. So it's just an example of a tactic that an attacker would use in order to prevent a defender from knowing a particular piece of information. It's important that from an attacker's perspective that they think through what those pieces of information are, and they protect them adequately. So obviously it's really important to attackers that they don't get caught. And this is I think a big there's a big debate that occurs within computer security about the subject of attribution. Obviously, from a state standpoint, it would be ideal if we could determine who was responsible for particular kinds of computer activity that we don't like, because then we can make them, we can cause consequences for them personally. We could sanction them or cause them to be arrested, etc. Unfortunately, on the internet, it's often possible to obfuscate the source of the activity that you're engaged in. And so if you're trying to do that, if you're trying to obfuscate where you're coming from, OPSEC becomes really important. The level of discipline that you have with respect to the operation that you're engaged in is really important. If you slip up and connect a couple dots together, then that can have a very negative impact on your ability to maintain the secrecy of your identity. So earlier this summer, the Department of Justice engaged in an action against this individual, whose name I will not attempt to pronounce, who lives in Russia, and he's responsible for the Game Over Zeus malware variant that was used to disseminate CryptoLocker. The way that, that you can go read this indictment, it's online, and the way that they were able to connect this guy, back to the operation of CryptoLocker is because, he accessed, I believe, I could be mistaken, but I believe what he did is he accessed a personal email account from an IP address that was used to control the botnet. And they were able to subpoena, I think, the IP addresses that were used to access the account from the mail provider. I could have the details wrong there, but I think that's the story. It's been a few months since I looked at the indictment. But it's a perfect example of an OPSEC error. He certainly shouldn't have been accessing his personal email from the computer that he was using to control the botnet if he intended to, maintain some anonymity. And it's those kinds of mistakes that I think that attribution is all about OPSEC failures. So there's this debate about whether or not attribution is possible. I think that attribution is possible if the attacker makes an OPSEC mistake. Attackers almost always make OPSEC mistakes. However, what the challenge here is that there can be debates about how dispositive the evidence is, or how circumstantial the evidence is. I think that the fact is that an ideal attacker, in a mathematical sense, would not make any OPSEC errors. They would never tie pieces of code together that shouldn't be tied together. They would never use their username in a string in their code. They would never log into their mail from an IP address that was associated with one of their operations. They would never talk about their operation using one of their personal accounts. They would maintain very religious separation between those things. And if they did, I think that they would be very difficult to attribute successfully. I think that attribution is therefore not really a technical problem in a traditional sense. There are technical aspects of attempting to find OPSEC failures, but people, I think, in the federal government desire some sort of solution to the problem of attribution. They hope that the internet can be re-architected in order to make attribution happen everywhere. I don't think that's really what it's about. I think it's about exploiting OPSEC failures, and OPSEC failures happen when the bad guy makes a mistake. We can try to induce mistakes through denial and deception, but we ultimately aren't in control of when those mistakes are going to occur. From a defender standpoint, what does OPSEC mean to me? I don't think most defenders think about OPSEC. The reality is that if you have sophisticated attackers targeting your environment, there's a whole bunch of information that you're potentially leaking that could be valuable to them. Your employees are out on LinkedIn. They're talking about what they do in their jobs. They're talking about what their titles are. They're connecting to each other. So I can go on LinkedIn and I can find the organizational structure of your company. I can figure out who the people are. I can see what they do in their jobs. I can see what technologies they're working with. If they're an expert in such and such a software package, that's probably because you have it in your network. This is particularly troubling when you talk about information security people, and I can go in there and see, well, he's an expert on configuring checkpoint firewalls. Well, now I know what kind of firewall they're using. This is all information that's relevant, to an attacker that he may be able to use to launch spear phishing attacks or, to prepare his campaign against your network. And so, it is relevant to defenders, but it's a very difficult problem to solve. If you have a big company, you've got lots of people doing different things. You can't tell them they're not allowed to have profiles on LinkedIn. That's how they're going to get their next job. You can't control what's on people's resumes. So this is the OPSEC process from the actual publication that the government has put out about OPSEC. It's a very short publication. So I mean, you could look it up after the talk. It's an easy read. And if you're an information security professional and you're looking at this process, I'm sure this looks very familiar to you. Identification of critical assets, analysis of threats, analysis of vulnerability, assessment of risk. Risk equals threat times vulnerability. Application of appropriate operations security countermeasures. We go through this process all the time. This is the standard risk management process that we use to do everything that we do. So you look at OPSEC from a risk management standpoint, and you ask, what are the most critical pieces of information that you do not want attackers to get access to about your environment? Are there a few things that you really don't want them to know? And then can you protect those things in particular? And I think if you focus your organization's OPSEC program on a limited number of pieces of information, then you have a greater chance of success, basically, than if you're trying to you just can't get everybody in a commercial environment to behave the way that people do in the military. It's just not possible. And so, but nevertheless, I think that OPSEC is useful to defenders in narrow circumstances where they actually can employ the kind of discipline that they need to employ. I just as an anecdote that pops in my head, I recall a discussion of an incident where the incident response team was utilizing voice over IP in order to work the incident, and there was no encryption, and the adversary was actually able to get access to the conference calls where the incident response team was working the incident that they were responsible for. So I don't remember the context in which that anecdote came up, but it's a perfect example of really the kind of problem that you can have. So and why certain pieces of information you might want to keep under a tight lid. So let's talk about threat intelligence. As our adversary has these OPSEC failures, we collect information about them. And we're hopefully assembling that information into an image of that adversary that's aligned to the kill chain stages, which I talked about before. We as an industry just have a tendency to oversimplify the concept, and that's why this slide is the way it is. I've got a big list of IP addresses and hashes and stuff up here. These are actually indicators that we published about APT1. People in our industry, so there's this thing that happens where we take terms from the world of military doctrine, like threat intelligence, and we adopt them in our culture, and we come up with different definitions for them in our culture that aren't the same definitions the military has. And there's something lost in that translation. In that some of these concepts are very rich, they have a lot of depth to them, and when we adopt them in our culture, we squeeze all of that richness out, and we get these very sort of simple one-dimensional things that don't provide us with as much value. And we also create a problem where you get misunderstandings between people who have been in a military background and people who have been in a computer security background about what the words that they're using mean. In fact, I think the CISSP manual has a specific definition of operations security, which has absolutely no relationship to OPSEC from a military perspective. So there's those communication difficulties as well. I tend to think of the word hacker, as a perfect example of one of these words that, means different things to different people, and there's all these communication problems that occur because people don't have the same definition in their head when they hear it. So, threat intelligence is a similar word. I think that we have a very one-dimensional understanding of threat intelligence in information security. We tend to think of it as a list of indicators like these. But really, intelligence is not an indicator set, it's a process. And it's a process of so this is good here, a thorough analysis and understanding of the threat's capabilities, strategy, and tactics, and how they can be used on the cyber terrain comprising your operational environment. It's about understanding the adversary from a comprehensive perspective, and not just knowing what IP address he's coming from. And you know, we like IP addresses because they're operationally useful, but the reality is that there's actually this, I don't know if I have a slide for it, there's this hierarchy that somebody put together of indicators. You know, an IP address is something that's very easy to pivot off of. I can get a new IP address in 15 minutes from a cloud service provider. So if you know what IP address I'm coming from, you know, and you're trying to defend your network from attacks that I'm launching, you know, I'm not too worried about that. I can change that IP address, and now you can't see me anymore. Things like my strategy and tactics from a holistic view, those are not things that I'm going to be changing. Okay, those are fundamental characteristics of how I function, and those characteristics, you know, may help you identify future operations that I engage in against you, and relate them to the things that have happened in the past if you understand them well. And so that's the power of threat intelligence. It's really the ability to, you know, not just actually to relate different actions that I've taken, but possibly to anticipate you know, what the adversary is going to do next. You know, we get involved in this chess game, you know, because we can't necessarily keep sophisticated targeted attackers out of our network because they have vulnerability information that we don't have. And so, you know, we want to detect them as quickly as possible when they're there. But then, you know, if we kick them out, you know, they may you know, just pivot to a different you know, trajectory that they may use to come back in the network, and we may lose visibility into them. So we have to constantly make these decisions about what we're going to do, and you know, really being able to anticipate what we think the attacker's after and where we think he might strike next enables us to have more confidence that you know, he hasn't done the thing that we're worried about, or you know, that we are in control of the situation. So there's a lot of documentation about the actual process of organizing intelligence, you know, planning, direction, collection, processing, and exploitation, analysis and production, dissemination, integration. I mean, there are whole parts of the federal government that do this, that are organized with lots and lots of people to, you know, collect information, to analyze it, to process it, to turn it into knowledge, and you know, and to make use of it. And there are ways to assess the effectiveness of the intelligence work that you're doing. There are a bunch of criteria that you can use to apply to the intelligence you're producing in order to determine, you know, whether you think that intelligence is actually effective or not. You know, TTPs is another term that I see thrown around in the information security world that comes from a military world, and you know, it may have a different definition to folks in the military than it does to folks in computer security. Tactics, techniques, and procedures. Again, TTPs are sometimes used as shorthand for a list of IP addresses, and that's not really what it means. Again, it's a set of indicators or descriptors of the way that the adversary functions within the environment. So I talked about this problem that you have where you know, someone has broken into your network. You know they're there. You could kick them out, but if you do, you know, they may pivot in such a way that you can't see them. You know, a friend of mine who spent a lot of time dealing with state-sponsored attacks on his network. You know, you know, I got to see him, you know, probably every few months, and once I coffee with him, and he said, I haven't seen anything since you last saw me. I haven't seen anything, and I think that I'm missing it. I think it's in my network, and I'm not catching it. You know, he felt more confident about his world when he knew that he was under attack than he did when it seemed like the coast was clear, because he felt like if the coast was clear, it was just that he didn't know what was going on. And so this becomes a difficult situation because you know, once the attack is happening, what do? Do you just let it, excuse me, do you let it proceed? So the military actually has a term for this, which is intel gain loss calculus. You know, what is the advantage of continuing to gain intelligence versus the advantage of taking action, which will cause you to lose that intelligence source, but, you know, perhaps protect yourself from what that actor can do. And in thinking about this, the risk of allowing the attack to continue increases the more that you know about the attacker. And that's it seems counterintuitive, but the problem is that when you first discover the attacker, you don't know anything about them, and so the scales are very heavily weighted toward the value of collecting more information. But the more that you know, there's a diminishing return associated with continuing to collect even more information. So once you get a pretty good idea of who they are, and again, going back to the like a holistic intelligence perspective, you know, what are their tactics, what are their tools, what are their procedures, what is their strategy? You know, once you get a more holistic view of that picture, the value of continuing to allow them to function diminishes. So that's a useful tool for people as a rule of thumb for thinking their way through these problems. The OODA loop. So I mentioned before that the OODA loop is a concept that came out of the Air Force. This Colonel John Boyd was thinking about the process that he engages in when he's in a dogfight, and he you know, he started trying to boil it down, and you know, he came up with this kind of simplified model, you know, but you know, he observes the environment that he's in. He orients himself within that environment, and then he makes a decision based on that orientation, and then he acts. And so you know, OODA loop process, you know, in an adversarial situation, you want to think about how you can move through that process. Sometimes this gets misinterpreted, but you know, on a basic level, you want to be more efficient at this than your adversary. You want to be able to observe, orient, decide, and act, you know, at a higher degree of resolution than your adversary can. And if you can do that, you're changing the reality that your adversary perceives at a rate faster than they can react to it, and that's how you get an advantage. But it's really important to emphasize that just going fast is not useful, because it's about doing the right things efficiently. So you don't want to degrade the correctness of your decisions in order to go fast. TK Gianni, who's the CTO of Landicope, has a really great webinar on the OODA loop, where he goes into depth about the OODA loop from an information security standpoint. It's out on YouTube. I highly recommend watching it. The OODA loop has been a tremendously influential concept in a number of operational contexts. Lots of you know, incident response organizations outside of the computer security world, things like firefighters and EMTs, focus on the OODA loop as a way of thinking about how to be effective at what they do. I think it's really valuable for computer incident response teams, you know, particularly in a context where they're dealing with advanced adversaries. So I'm running low on time here. I have one other concept. Just run through a few concepts that we have in the slides. You know, targeting is a concept in the military where they think about different ways to you know, to cause effects upon a target, including deceiving, degrading, destroying, or influencing that target. And I think it's important to understand that things that you do, or the military may use computer attacks as one of the effects that they may want to cause on a target, alongside traditional kinetic effects. And they're integrating that kind of thinking directly into their overall model of how they cause effects on a target. So, you know, there are foreign doctrines. So a lot of our doctrine is based, as I said, on Western thinking that goes back hundreds of years. If you look at foreign governments, they have their own intellectual traditions that go back just as far, and they have completely different ways of thinking about these problems. That causes, you know, totally different approaches, which is very interesting, both in terms of what you can also learn from reading those approaches, as well as what those approaches tell you about how adversaries who use them, you know, how they think and approach problems. So there's sources specifically regarding both Russian and Chinese thinking with respect to cyber war that are potentially very valuable and will help you understand those kinds of threat actors if they're operating in your environment. So I highly recommend looking at them. We have tons and tons of references. You know, you'll get a copy of these slides, you know, from Lane Cope after the webinar is over. Also, if you go on Black Hat's site and you find our paper and our slides from Black Hat, all the references are in there. So with that, I'm going to open it up very briefly for questions.